Hello, everyone. I am Behruz Qamari Tabrizi. I'm the director of the Sharmin and Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies at Princeton University. Before we begin, I would like to extend my appreciation for all the work and efforts that our events coordinator, Becky Parnian, puts into this series, as well as our IT support, Pete Nowak. This is our second post-Nowruz Happy Spring webinar for this year. And before we get into our conversation, let me just go over some of the logistics. The entire conversation today would be 1 hour, there will be a presentation of the book that we are discussing today for 15 to 20 minutes, and a conversation and discussion of the book for another 20-25 minutes, and then we'll open the screen for your questions. You can submit your questions through the Q&A link at the bottom of your screen on the right side, and I would read and pose your questions to our guests today. So without further ado, let me introduce our guests today. We have with us Professor Annie Tracy Samuel, who's an assistant professor of history and a member of the graduate faculty at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. She is the president of the Southeast Regional Middle East and Islamic Studies Society. Prior to joining the University of Tennessee, Professor Tracy Samuel served as a research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. She holds a PhD and an MA in history from Tel Aviv University and a BA in history and political science from Columbia University. She specializes in the modern history of Iran and the Middle East. Professor Tracy Samuel's scholarship has been published in a variety of journals, including International Security, Diplomatic History, and Harvard International Security Discussion Paper Series. Her commentaries on current affairs has been featured by The Hill, Lawfare, CNN, and The Atlantic, among others. She has presented her work at Middle East Studies Association for the Study of Middle East and Africa, and the American Historical Association, and she has participated in policy briefings at the US State Department and the Department of Defense. The book that is hot out of the press a few months ago, we are discussing today, is this beautifully, clearly written book, The Unfinished History of the Iran-Iraq War, Faith, Power, Firepower, and Iran's Revolutionary Guard, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2000, at the end of 2001. Here with us to discuss the book is Maryam Alemzadeh, a postdoctoral fellow at the Sharmin and Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies at Princeton University. Dr. Alemzadeh holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago. She wrote her dissertation on the Islamic Revolutionary Guard's core and post-revolutionary state building in Iran from 1979 to 1982. Maryam is currently working on her book manuscript, which addresses the formation of the IRGC as a state-sponsored yet independent and spontaneous revolutionary militia. The book is based on first-hand research on the IRGC's first generation of commanders, volunteers, political proponents, and critics as they struggle to find order in chaos on a daily basis. Maryam's book revisits questions of continuity, change, and institution building through the lens of everyday practices. Her research and policy papers have been published in the British Journal of Middle East Studies, Foreign Affairs, and the Crown Center's Middle East Brief Series, among other places. And as it is now official, we can share the great news that from September 2022, Maryam will join the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies at the Oxford Middle East Center as Associate Professor of History and Politics of Iran. So on that note, but before I wanted to ask Annie to start, I wanted to show you this little 2 volumes of books. This is only a bibliography of the the Sacred Defense that is published in Iran, and I just wanted to show this to highlight the significance of this book that often this literature that is so neglected in the scholarly works on Iran and Revolutionary Guard and the war, and to show you, to have a sense of what an incredible feat it is to delve into these documents as Professor Tracy Samuel has done. So with that, I give the screen to you, and welcome, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Qamari Tabrizi. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and thank you as well to the Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies at Princeton for hosting me, to Becky and Pete for helping to facilitate the talk, and of course to Maryam for joining me in the conversation. So I will go ahead and share my screen. So today I will be discussing my new book, which is called The Unfinished History of the Iran-Iraq War, Faith, Firepower, and Iran's Revolutionary Guards, which analyzes how and why the Guards have documented and composed the history of the Iran-Iraq War, how the Guards explain the course and outcome of the war, the relationship between the war and the Islamic Revolution, and their own roles in prosecuting the conflict, and then what the results reveal about the IRGC, the Iran-Iraq War, and the Islamic Republic. The IRGC is the military and political organization that is charged with guarding both Iran's national security, so its borders and territorial integrity, and the Islamic Republic and the revolution that brought it to power. The IRGC was not set up to replace Iran's regular military. Rather, it was to function as an additional revolutionary armed force, one whose loyalty to the Islamic Republic would be beyond doubt, and that could check the power of the regular military. In the first year after the revolution, the IRGC was occupied mostly with combating internal opposition to the new Islamic Republic. But with the outbreak of the Iran-Iraq War, the Guards turned their attention to combating the external threat to the regime. That war began with the Iraqi invasion of Iran on September 22nd, 1980, which President Saddam Hussein intended to be a quick military operation to check Iran's revolutionary regime, seize the oil-rich territory in southwest Iran, and safeguard his rule. However, the war soon transformed into a brutal and drawn-out conflict that instead revitalized the flagging revolution. After a series of victories allowed Iraqi forces to advance into Iran through early 1981, Iranian forces halted the march and retook most of their territory over the course of the next year. Iran then took the fight into Iraq in July 1982, but was unable to gain or hold much ground. So as the war stalled, it also broadened to entangle the rest of the Middle East and both superpowers. It continued largely as a bloody stalemate until August 20th, 1988, when a UN-backed ceasefire came into force. The end of the war restored the status quo ante, with both regimes still in power and without territorial adjustments. The war had a profound impact on Iran, the Islamic Republic, and the IRGC, transforming the IRGC into the powerful institution it has since become. Today, the IRGC consists of a collection of military, political, economic, and cultural organizations. Its members and former members hold positions throughout the government. It has its own Army, Navy, and Air Force. It oversees the elite Quds Force and the besieged paramilitary forces. It plays a central role in the state's weapons programs and has substantial influence over Iran's military doctrine and how the state defines its security and national interests. One of the clearest indications of the war's significance to the IRGC is the vast number of publications the organization has produced about the conflict. Those publications, on which my book is based, provide us with a rare opportunity to go inside the IRGC and to understand Iran's recent history as the Revolutionary Guards view it themselves. The publications accordingly constitute an invaluable resource for understanding the IRGC, the Iran-Iraq War, and the Islamic Republic, but one that hasn't been researched or written about by scholars. So then what are these IRGC publications? Where do they come from, and how should we understand the history they contain? Well, the first and most important point that I want to make about the IRGC's history of the Iran-Iraq War is that from the beginning of the war to the present, the Revolutionary Guard's efforts to record the history of the war and the publications that have resulted from those efforts have been organized and guided by some of the highest levels of the IRGC and by some of its founding members. So this is not an informal attempt by individual or low-ranking guards to write the history of the war in the organization's name. Far from it, really. The project of recording and publishing the history of the war is fundamental to the IRGC itself. And so the fact that existing analyses of the organization have failed to consider that project exposes some of the deficiencies in our current understanding of that institution. Neglect of the IRGC sources can be attributed to a few different factors. First, much of the scholarship on the Iran-Iraq War was published during or right after that conflict, which was before almost all of the IRGC sources were available. Second, the IRGC publications are not widely accessible, especially outside of Iran. There are hardly any traces of them in existing studies, so researchers have not had reason to know of their existence. I think their imperceptibility has also been compounded by the popular image of the IRGC as an ideological military unlikely to invest in historical scholarship. Finally, all of the IRGC sources are in Persian, which many people writing about Iran don't read. The IRGC began recording the history of the Iran-Iraq War in the spring of 1981, which was just several months into the conflict. The project was organized first by the IRGC's Political Bureau, which established a war history department with the sole purpose of documenting the conflict. Then in March 1985, the IRGC historians formed the Center for War Studies and Research, which is now known as the Holy Defense Research and Documentation Center, or HDRDC. And that was established as an independent institution under the authority first of the IRGC General Command and then after the war of the IRGC Joint Staff. During the Iran-Iraq War, the work of documenting the conflict was carried out by a team of specially trained IRGC researchers known as war narrators. And the narrators were embedded in and covered the war from the highest levels of policy and decision-making to the operational commands and front lines. Narrators used a variety of methods to document the history of the war. They recorded the activities and conversations of the commanders and policymakers whom they shadowed throughout the conflict. They conducted interviews with the actors prosecuting and participating in the war. They collected documents, and they observed and recorded what they witnessed. Since the ceasefire, the HGRDC has focused both on cataloging the records it collected during the war and on publishing historical analyses of the conflict. By far the largest and most important of the center's publications is called The Chronology of the Iran-Iraq War. According to its authors, the complete series of at least 57 immense volumes will cover the 9.5-year period from the victory of the revolution in February 1979 to the end of the war in August 1988. And the series is intended to be an analytical and documented reference work for researchers and others who are interested in the war. Volumes of the chronology series have been gradually published according to the 57-volume plan and have appeared out of order. In addition to the war chronology, the center has published several other series and monographs that analyze the war in a variety of ways. Two series, the 6-volume survey of the Iran-Iraq War and the 5-volume analysis of the Iran-Iraq War, are both organized chronologically and examine the important issues and progression of the war in different periods. There are several series of atlases that focus on particular geographical regions, battles, and military divisions. There's also a series called Critique and Review of the Iran-Iraq War, which includes 5 volumes on the critical questions of the conflict, such as whether it was unavoidable and why it continued for as long as it did. And that series was produced with the goal of revisiting the histories and publications on the war and addressing some of their shortcomings. When we look at the content of the IRGC publications, we see that the interpretation and significance of the war's history, as it's been written by the Revolutionary Guards, challenge many of the prevailing scholarly and popular characterizations of the Islamic Republic, which are often based on Western sources and perspectives. In particular, the latter have given much weight to the rhetoric Iranian leaders used during the war, and also to the importance of faith and revolutionary fervor in understanding the Islamic Republic and its prosecution of the conflict. However, the research that I present in the book demonstrates that the role of faith was not that simplistic, which can be seen in the way the Revolutionary Guards construe the relationship between faith and firepower in prosecuting the war. So in this context, I'm using faith to refer to the roles of religion, revolutionary ideology, and what the Guards often term Iran's spirit of resistance in fighting the war. And I'm using firepower to refer to the roles of military professionalism, tactics and strategy, and the use and importance of weapons. I've derived the concept of faith and firepower from a declaration attributed to then Majlis Speaker Hashemi Rafsanjani, that the faith of the Islamic troops is stronger than the superior firepower of Iran's troops. Now, in much of the existing scholarship, which does not take account of the IRGC sources, A literal interpretation of that and similar statements has been used to define the way Iranian leaders viewed and prosecuted the war. And also to argue that groups like the IRGC were incapable of viewing the conflict in military terms, and that they were concerned only with faith and not with firepower. My analysis of the IRGC publications challenges those claims by demonstrating that the Guards' understanding of the relationship between faith and firepower is unlike and much more sophisticated than what the existing studies suggest. The Guards, in fact, assert that faith and firepower are complementary rather than contradictory, and that both were important in fighting the war. In addition, and even more importantly, I think, the IRGC publications reveal that both the experience of the Iran-Iraq War and the project of composing the historical narrative of the conflict are really central to the IRGC and accordingly to understanding the organization. Their significance stems from several factors, including the ways in which the war and the ongoing revolutionary process in Iran influenced one another, the war's role in legitimizing and institutionalizing the IRGC and the new Islamic Republic as a whole, the expansion and evolution of the IRGC through its participation in the war into the powerful organization it has since become. And finally, to the fact that the IRGC views history as a vital tool for shaping national identity and power. The IRGC histories are further distinguished by their authors' proximity to the people and events under examination. For example, according to one volume, the cohesive group of war narrators was like a living organism that encompassed all the dimensions of the war, which were linked together as one by the extensive network of narrators. So essentially, the IRGC narrators are portrayed as the war incarnate, as constituting a being through which the war is kept alive. It makes sense then that the development of the IRGC's documentation of the war mirrored the evolution of both the Iran-Iraq War and the IRGC as a whole, which highlights how the project really emblematizes the organization and the centrality of the war to its legitimacy and identity. One of the things that I saw was that the IRGC authors are explicitly conscious of these parallels and of the particular circumstances that made their roles possible. The IRGC's identity as a fledgling and amorphous revolutionary organization was really instrumental to its expansion and success in the war. In part because the IRGC had few pre-established structures, constraining its ability to develop and adapt. Further, as vanguards of the revolution, the Guards were acutely focused on what was unparalleled and unique about themselves, which helped inspire the conviction that the war they were fighting was different and revolutionary, and that it therefore needed to be preserved. In sum then, the Revolutionary Guards are very much aware of the power and agency of history. The IRGC's assessments of the Iran-Iraq War remind us that history must be both made and written, that the content of the past is not fixed or singular, and that it's only in the specific contents of the war's historical narrative that the meaning and permanence of the conflict will be determined. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much for this very comprehensive presentation of the book. And if Dr. Alemzadeh is with us, I would invite her to discuss the book and raise some questions for you. Maryam?
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Behrooz. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And thank you and congratulations, Annie, for the awesome book. I am really excited about this conversation. This is a topic I've been working on for the past 7 or 8 years. It's scary to think about that. But yeah, I read it with great interest, and it helped me think through issues that I had not thought about, and learn stuff about issues that I had thought about, but not in this perspective. So yeah, grateful to have this opportunity. So I'll provide a very short commentary and then pose a few questions that hopefully will start a conversation. Dr. Tracy Samuel offers a meticulous and thorough reading of a great number of IRGC publications, and particularly those published by the HDRDC office. This is the first comprehensive study of IRGC publications. The Guards are in possession of the largest and richest war archive in Iran, and its multiple offices have been very prolific in publishing analyses based on these documents. And also they have been publishing some of the original documents within these publications. And I should add that they do not let just anyone within these archives, so that makes these publications an even more valuable source. And this is exactly why Dr. Tracy Samuel's book, The Unfinished History of Iran, the Iran-Iraq War, is such a welcome addition to studies of contemporary Iran, the Iran-Iraq War, and the IRGC in particular. Many scholars, as she mentioned, assume that state-sponsored publications in Iran are highly ideological and therefore unreliable, and the assumption is justified, at least to some extent. So until recently, when a few scholars have indeed engaged in these or similar publications, it had stopped scholars from taking these sources seriously and engaging with them on an academic level. But if we ask the right questions from these sources, we can still find very reliable answers within them. And this is exactly what I believe Dr. Tracy Samuel has done. She asked us to take a look at the IRGC's prolific historiography of the Iran-Iraq War to learn more about their self-understanding, to see how they perceive their existence as the revolutionary army and their role in the most definitive stretch of the Islamic Republic's history, which is the Iran-Iraq War. And I think most importantly, she invites us to think about how the IRGC takes seriously the very task of writing history, and the organization's awareness of what it means for consolidating its position within both the Iranian state and to some extent, to a lesser extent, the society as well. She insightfully considers the possibility that the IRGC's attempt at providing a well-documented, solid-looking, and somewhat self-critical history of the war is actually an attempt to enter the more serious academic conversation about war history, to be taken seriously beyond ideological propaganda. That doesn't mean that they necessarily always succeed in that, but even considering this intention alone lets us learn about the organizational image that they'd like to project. An organization relying not just on the power of faith and commitment, but also on professionalism, whether in conducting the war or in writing history itself. The main theme that emerges out of this detailed and arduous study is that in the Guard's own analysis, the IRGC is not just about faith, but also about firepower. The quote-unquote faith and firepower discourse might have been prevalent in the war days to boost motivation and morale, but the elaborate retrospective picture that the IRGC paints makes it clear that technical military proficiency is an equally strong part of the organization's identity. At least the Guards strive to portray this identity. So Annie's great study in this way makes us think about the IRGC in a new light and opens the door to new scholarly adventures and investigations. So I will now pose a few questions in this spirit and hope that we can have a fruitful conversation about them. So my first couple of questions, which I'll pose together, is about methodology. The first one is that it's undeniable, and the book's main argument actually acknowledges that the IRGC has a much broader agenda than just narrating what happened during the war. And that agenda is, of course, politically charged, supercharged. And I was wondering if you could tell us more about how accurate you found the extensive IRGC publications, which the book is based on, and how you went about triangulating and contextualizing what they offer. The second methodological question that I have is about the structure of the chronology series, the 57 volume chronology. And that is, they offer sort of a twofold material. One side of it is the rather long analytical introductions to each volume, which provides a big picture for the sequence of events discussed in that volume. And that is actually where you can find the IRGC's take, the interpretation of the time span that the book addresses. But after the introduction come the well-documented specifics of each day's events. You have provided a great analysis of the IRGC's take on the events and its implications. And you righteously cite mostly the introductions for this purpose, because that's where the opinion is. I wonder what your takeaway is from the way IRGC historians present data per se in the main body of the volumes. About the selection of data, the arrangement, the occasional analyses they provide, the footnotes, the unconventional punctuation marks, especially they love the exclamation marks. They put multiple of them in front of assertions by unfavorable politicians or events that they find just bizarre and unreasonable, and so on and so forth. And lastly, what do the exclusions from the data tell us? What is IRGC talking about when they are not talking about, for example, the regular Army's role, or the unacceptably high number of casualties in the war that they caused, or the conundrums and internal schisms they experienced before the war started, or even during the war, and about how the war prepared them to have the heaviest hand in the Iranian repression machine today? Is there a way to read between the lines and find clues to make up for the omission bias? So to recap this very long question, this was much more than one question, I'm sorry. First is about the accuracy of the sources. The second is about what the presentation, the particular presentation of data can tell us. And thirdly, what does the data omissions and data exclusions tell us?
Wonderful. Well, thank you. So when it comes to the first question about the sort of the broader agenda of these sources and how I went about assessing their accuracy, I did a good amount of triangulating and contextualizing the publications, especially because, as you mentioned, the IRGC certainly has interests at stake and power to protect. And I wanted to make sure that I analyzed their sources critically in light of that. Given how extensive the source base was, and the fact that the IRGC sources hadn't received really focused attention, and therefore that my sort of overarching aim was really uncovering and analyzing what they contained. I decided to focus my contextualization and triangulation efforts mainly on news sources and press reports from the period that the book covers, as well as on secondary sources, especially because that allowed me to check the accuracy of the IRGC's claims, particularly about the events and course of the war. And overall, that process revealed that their claims about sort of what happened when, the successes and failures of given battles were quite accurate to a degree that I was surprised by. I also used non-IRGC Iranian sources to put the IRGC publications in the broader Iranian historical narrative of the war in that context. But given the enormous amount of material on the war published in Iran, I think it's important to recognize just how extensive the Iranian historiography of the war is, that simply narrowing myself to focus just on the IRGC publications was still quite the task. And so putting those publications into the overarching narrative was difficult to do within the confines of a single book. And so that's why I brought in those non-IRGC sources more selectively. And then I also focused on checking the accuracy of the claims, ensuring that what they were saying about the course of the war, the basic events of the war, was correct. I wanted to make sure that I was always taking a critical light to those kinds of claims, especially. When it comes to the question of the content of these chronologies, I completely agree with your characterization. The chronologies begin with these introductions, which is where the bulk of the analysis is, and sometimes they're very lengthy. These introductions, they're sort of short books unto themselves. But then those introductions are followed by pages upon pages of data. And so I had several sort of takeaways about how the IRGC historians present the data. The first of which is simply the wealth of it, the tremendous amount of information included just in these volumes. And as you mentioned, these volumes represent a selection of an even larger number of sources housed in an archive, which is very difficult to access. So the wealth of the information is quite overwhelming. I was struck particularly by how well documented the chapters of the chronologies are. So each chapter of the chronology corresponds to a single day. And each day or chapter is followed by a works cited list where the authors specify where the information contained in that chapter came from, often citing internal documents to the HDRDC, in other cases citing other Iranian documents, other governmental sources, and also press reports. The chapters themselves are quite well organized, which is also something I was struck by. Each day begins with military issues, followed by non-military issues, so internal political issues and international issues. Many of the sources cited, as I mentioned, are these internal HDRDC sources, including what is incredibly valuable, sometimes reproductions of the sources themselves. So a sort of scanned copy that is reproduced. Sometimes it's a longer excerpt. Extensive maps, lots and lots of, or a good amount of pictures in the sources too. So there's a variety of kinds of material in the bodies of the chronologies. I was also struck by sort of the inclusion of some of the more quotidian aspects of the war, what life was like for soldiers on a day-to-day basis, in some instances when they were very cold, when they were fighting on the northern front, and found that their motivation was lacking simply because they were so cold. There's records of meetings of commanders and documentation of what was discussed, who said what, points of agreement and disagreement. There's also inclusion of plenty of positive aspects, or sort of a more positive portrayal of the war, but not entirely. They also discuss problems, issues, setbacks, shortcomings, things like that. I've also noticed that there's an increased standardization over time. So the very first volume of the chronology sort of sets the stage for this series, but then after the publication, I'd say maybe 10 to 15 volumes, it really became increasingly standard, so that there's very similar language in the prefaces to each of these volumes, which is a sign of how this project has become more institutionalized and standardized. I also was quite interested by the explicit self-reflection of how to select what to include and what not to include. At one point, the authors say, they sort of say, what is to be made of the mass of facts, and discuss how they struggled with finding the right balance between presenting as much information as possible and not wanting to overwhelm the reader. When it comes to the unconventional punctuation and exclamation points, that's also something that I certainly noted, and was not entirely sure what to make of, but I took it as a sign of the war's continued resonance in Iran, and a certain degree of exasperation with how it was handled at the time, especially when those exclamation points follow statements or positions of actors that the IRGC is dissatisfied with. And then finally, when it comes to the omissions and understanding what's included and what's not, I do think overall I was struck more by the inclusions than by the exclusions, just because I was expecting a wholly more positive portrayal than what was offered. So for example, I was struck by the discussion of the regular army's role and the generally positive characterization of the regular army. That's certainly not universally true. There are certainly critiques of the regular military for being too conventional, for not thinking outside the box. But often the sources discuss the combination of the forces and how the prosecution of the war proceeded best when the forces were combined. But the notable points of exclusion are certainly the ones that you mentioned. They don't dwell on the high casualties and their own responsibilities for them. They don't talk about how the war helped position them to take on this dominant role in the state's repressive apparatus, which I think indicates certainly that those are things that the IRGC does not want to advertise itself as being about or being associated with. But I think one of the things that also helped me assess those exclusions, especially relating to things like the IRGC's role in domestic politics and repression today, was viewing the publications through a historical lens, both in terms of me being a historian and in terms of the IRGC authors explicitly characterizing the publications as historical in nature. And understanding that while the exclusion or de-emphasis of certain aspects of the war help us understand the IRGC's history, the exclusion of discussion of the IRGC's roles today from a book that deals with the history of the Iran-Iraq War makes sense from a history writing perspective, and demonstrates, I think, that the IRGC takes the writing of history as we would understand it quite seriously.
Thank you so much for the comprehensive answer. Yeah, I agree with you on almost everything. And yeah, this all shows us their particular take on history writing and on the agenda of like professionalism in doing so. So I noticed that we have quite a few questions lining up, so I'll limit myself to just one more question, and then I hope that we can continue this conversation later. And so my last question is that you do a great job demonstrating how in the IRGC self-understanding, at least faith and firepower go hand in hand as complementary assets. The examples that you provide, in those examples, these two forces still operate as separate sources of organizational strength. For instance, faith fuels motivation and provides meaning, while firepower propels the actual battle. I wonder if you observed any indication of a fusion of the two on the battlefield. In other words, how does the IRGC's strength in mobilization and motivation of its soldiers based on faith translate into non-conventional combat styles and its organization at large, if there is such a thing at all? Another way to put this is, what is this revolutionary warfare that the IRGC always boasts about and the Army always criticizes as non-existent? I was wondering if you have any take on that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And in working on this project, I certainly thought a lot about how to conceive of and construct this idea of faith and firepower, and the extent to which they're really distinct, and what defines the relationship between them. So while in some cases faith is separate and distinct from firepower, in other cases it operates sort of more as firepower itself, as something that propels the actual battle, like firepower does, as you said. So for example, faith will fuel motivation and will provide meaning. But I think, and the guards described how that can have a real impact on the battlefield, in cases when commitment brings a higher tolerance for risk, and a greater willingness to fight, which is something that helped the Iranian forces in battle. Whereas the lack of morale or commitment on the part of Iraqi forces really impaired their performance. And so in that way, faith really serves as or becomes fused with firepower. And I think that's another way to look at this whole revolutionary style of war, that it is the fusion of the two. And that these aspects of warfare sometimes operate alongside one another through different strengths, but often as your work on sort of charisma and understanding how the IRGC conceived of what they were doing in the war and why they were there and what gave meaning to them. In that way, we can also see that faith really becomes fused with firepower.
Thank you so much, Annie. I'll give the floor back to Behrooz because we have a lot of questions to address.
That's right. Yeah, this conversation can go on for a very long time, I guess. One of the questions that we have here, and I think that's the $64,000 question, which is a very hot topic also in Iran these days, that is there a conversation in these documents that you reviewed and examined about why the Iranian government decided to continue the war after the first 2 years? Of course, I think we don't have enough time to go through all the details of that, but it's a very hot issue and a very sort of contested issue, especially within the Revolutionary Guards, and also about your own experience of going through these documents at the sort of the emotional level, that these are not easy documents to examine, and this was one of the bloodiest wars of the century, and how was your own emotional engagement with your research and your examination of documents?
Those are two great questions. The first one is certainly the question, or one of the big questions about the Iran-Iraq war. And it's something that I do discuss at length in the book. But I will say, sort of in short, that this is one of the areas where the IRGC sources are incredibly valuable. Much of what had been written about the using Iranian documents about this decision to continue the war was based on Rafsanjani's memoirs. And the IRGC sources contain additional documents. They include records of conversations between IRGC commanders and Supreme Leader Khomeini, And in those documents, the guards present the decision to continue the war as first and foremost a matter of defense. That they were very skeptical that accepting a ceasefire at that point in time, when there were Iraqi troops still occupying parts of Iranian territory, when there were troops that were sort of positioned to threaten territory, the guards and certain other factions in Iran were concerned that this would not provide long-term security for Iran, and so felt that continuing the war was necessary because of that. And it's certainly something watching the most recent news out of the ongoing war, when we're hearing similar claims about a scaling back of the Russian forces in Ukraine, and if that will actually happen and what that means. I was reminded of the way the guards described their skepticism about Iraq's partial withdrawals and repositionings. I think there's no question that the decision to continue the war, the decision to invade Iraq, was quite disastrous, leading to the prolongation of the war to some of its darkest years, and really did not achieve the kind of enhanced security that the guards hoped it would. So I can certainly say much more about that. I will also say actually that there is still debate as well within the IRGC, not just within Iran, but within the IRGC, and looking at how IRGC commanders are still discussing this issue, both in the publications and in, for example, the events that the HDRDC puts on. It has been really interesting to see how unsettled that issue is, and how there's a great deal of conflict over it, even within the IRGC. When it comes to my experience with the documents, I do think it was, at times it was not easy. The war, as was acknowledged, was heinous, was incredibly brutal, especially in the cases where chemical weapons were used. And so for the most part, I was able to go through these documents and, read the text and deal with that just fine. But there were certainly times when I would flip a page and there would be an image of a victim of chemical weapons that was incredibly difficult to see. But that's something that the IRGC historians discuss as for them a defining feature of this war, of how heinous it was. And so I think understanding that from a visceral perspective helped me appreciate their narrative of the conflict.
Yeah. Thank you so much. There is also a question about the importance of different genres and in narrating this history, and you do refer to this in the book, but I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit about different genres in which the IRGC engages in narrating the history, and whether you see any changes in or highlighting one genre over others throughout the years.
Yes, absolutely. So there are, starting with just within the IRGC publications, there are different genres. And the sources that I focus on in the book are a specific genre of that. So they're the publications produced after the war by the Holy Defense Research and Documentation Center. And those are, the vast majority of these are historical, nonfiction, analytical accounts. The chronology, other series, and these have actually continued to expand in just since I've been researching them in the past decade or so. One of the newer projects, for example, is having IRGC commanders write an oral history of the war in collaboration with one of the war narrators. And those have begun to come out. When I began the project, there was a series called the Guide Atlas, which looked at different regions and different cities, but now there's several different series of atlases. Another one looks at specific military units and sort of follows those units. So those are that's the subgenres within the genre of the historical HDRDC publications. There are also other IRGC publications produced by other branches of the IRGC, including during the war. And those are more propagandistic in nature, where we can see that the concern is much more about mobilization and faith and sort of defining this war in the rhetorical terms that were common in that period. And so we can certainly notice a shift from the guards as really fighters in the war and shaping the war as it happened to historians of the war. And that's, of course, not to mention all of the many non-IRGC publications on the war in Iran, which encompass a variety of genres. There's a book, an excellent book about Iranian wartime cinema, which is an extensive field. There are memoirs, some of which Dr. Alemzadeh has used from IRGC, from the regular military. There's other organizations devoted to the history of the war. So this is an extensive field with many genres.
One of the fields that caught my attention in that 2-volume bibliography was a whole section of children's literature about war. And that was quite an impressive kind of list of publications there.
Yes.
There is also another question about whether you see any kind of references, particular conversations about things that were happening in the front line, not related to the battle, but preparation of food, cleaning, treatment, wounded. And I think from there, we can also open a sort of door to the gendered question of war and how it's played out, and whether or not in your documents you see a very extensive conversation about life outside the battlefield in the front line.
Yes. So the sources that I use do include accounts of sort of life on the front lines, things involving sort of preparations for battle. I remember a description of them sort of projecting noise through loudspeakers to try to sort of create confusion. There's descriptions of food and when food supplies were low. There are some descriptions of sort of boredom and anticipation, descriptions of injuries and caring for the wounded. There isn't too much focus in I wasn't sort of looking for it either on the gender aspect, but there is a fantastic new book that looks directly at women's roles in the Iran-Iraq War, which I don't remember the name of, but that's certainly something that also has not gotten extensive attention. So I was really happy to see that there is a new book looking at women and gender in the Iran-Iraq War as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. One last very quick question. We have a question about the cover page photo. Yes. Can you just tell us a little bit about where this photo is from and what does it depict?
Yes, so it's an image that I got from Getty. If you've written a book, getting permissions for things is very difficult, especially to try to sort of reach out to the IRGC and say, hey, can I use this picture that you own? That wasn't quite an option. But so I found this picture on Getty, and it depicts a guard recording the history of a commander in the war. And that was sort of the image base that I was working with, and I was sort of looking for something that would work well, found this one and was very, very happy with it, especially as you can see, right, there's the faith, there's the firepower, there's the recording of the history. And I think it does a great job of getting at the subjects of the war. And I am thrilled with how Cambridge put the cover together.
Okay, wonderful. It's a good moment to conclude our conversation with this beautiful photo of the book cover. And again, thank you to both of you, Dr. Tracy Samuel and Dr. Alemzadeh. And hopefully next time we can host you and bring back Dr. Alemzadeh from Oxford for an in-person conversation. Hopefully next time with Maryam's book that we can discuss here. And again, I'm very grateful to you, to both of you for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you. Great pleasure.
Bye-bye.